A billionaire CEO paused a crisis meeting, demanding, "Bring anyone who can fix this." Moments later, a 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress walked in, holding a crayon drawing, and saved the entire company. The 47th floor of Wexford Innovations was suffocating in silence. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched along the walls, but not even the breathtaking skyline of New York could distract from the crisis that had seized the room. Around the long obsidian conference table sat the company's top executives, faces pale, jaws clenched, eyes darting between their laptops and the giant LED screen at the front. On that screen was a graph, brutal in its simplicity, a line descending like a knife slash, reflecting the catastrophic drop in Wexford's stock price. Jacob Wells, the CEO and founder, stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders tense beneath a perfectly tailored light blue suit. His brown hair was neatly combed back, though a few rebellious strands had started to fall onto his forehead. The sharp lines of his face seemed even more severe under the white lights, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, piercing, glacial blue, cold as steel yet burning with pressure. For 5 years, Wexford Innovations had poured its soul into developing Aurora, an ambitious smart city interface meant to revolutionize urban living. Investors had believed in the dream, throwing billions at the promise of a future where city infrastructure would respond to citizens as naturally as a conversation. But now, just weeks before launch, the project teetered on the edge of disaster. The interface was too complex, user feedback was brutal, and media leaks were already branding it a solution no one asked for. Jacob had listened in silence as the last member of his executive team offered yet another excuse, another failed strategy masked as a pivot. His patience, stretched thin across years of sleepless nights and boardroom wars, finally snapped. He slammed his palm onto the sleek surface of the table. The sudden echo made more than one person flinch. "Bring me anyone who can fix this," Jacob said, his voice calm but saturated with a cold fury that sent a shiver down the spines of everyone present. "I don't care who they are. A designer, an intern, a janitor. Anyone. Just someone who isn't blind to the obvious." No one moved. The room remained frozen in a haze of fear and resignation. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the corporate empire crumbling within its glass towers. Then, a sound that didn't belong pierced the tension. The soft creak of the heavy oak door. Heads turned. And in stepped a little girl. She was no older than 7, her golden hair neatly tied in a ponytail, her bright yellow dress standing out like a sunbeam against the grayscale suit surrounding her. In her small hands, she clutched a crayon drawing on a white sheet of paper. Gasps and confused murmurs rippled through the room. The CFO leaned towards Jacob, his voice a nervous whisper laced with disbelief. "Who is this?" Jacob, for a moment, said nothing. His expression softened, though the storm still lingered in his eyes. Then, almost reverently, he replied. "That's my daughter. Lily Wells." Unbothered by the tension, Lily walked straight to her father's side, stood on her tiptoes, and slid her drawing onto the conference table. She turned the page so it faced the executives, tapped her finger on a cluster of colorful shapes and lines, and with the innocent confidence only a child could possess, said clearly, "Here's your solution." The silence that followed was not like before. It wasn't heavy with defeat. It was confused, almost fragile. As if something utterly illogical had just cracked the solid wall of corporate logic, and no one knew how to react. Jacob knelt beside his daughter, eyes fixed on her drawing. For the first time in weeks, the tight knot in his chest loosened. None of the men and women in that room realized it yet, but the empire had just been saved. Lily's presence in the boardroom felt surreal, almost as if a character from a children's story had stepped into a battlefield of corporate warfare. The executives, all hardened veterans of the business world, sat frozen, their gazes flicking between Jacob and the little girl in the yellow dress who now stood confidently at the center of the storm. Her drawing, a simple yet chaotic burst of colors, lay on the obsidian table where, moments ago, financial forecasts and strategic reports had been displayed. Circles connected by curved lines, small stick figures walking on them, arrows swirling in playful loops, and in the corner, a bright yellow sun smiling down. It was a child's imagination poured onto paper. But Lily didn't fidget. She didn't hide behind her father. She stood tall in her innocence, her small finger tracing the paths on the paper as she explained in a tone so natural it was disarming. "Daddy's city is too full of walls," she said, as if pointing out something obvious. "People don't like walking into walls. They want to walk on paths, like in the park. You just have to give them paths." Her words floated in the air, simple yet cutting through layers of over-engineered concepts and jargon the executives had been buried under for years. For a moment, it felt like no one breathed. Jacob, still kneeling beside her, found himself staring at the crude loops and curves she had drawn. And for the first time, the chaotic mess that had plagued the Aurora interface seemed to unravel in his mind, as if his daughter's innocent perspective had sliced through the noise and revealed the core of their problem. The CTO, Mark Hudson, tried to mask his discomfort with a scoff. "Jacob, this is cute, but we're not designing playgrounds. Our system architecture." He didn't finish. Jacob stood up slowly, cutting him off with a stare that silenced the room. It wasn't anger this time. It was something far more unsettling: clarity. He took the drawing from the table, holding it up for everyone to see. "She's right," Jacob said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that demanded attention. "We've been building walls. Every user flow, every feature gate, every UI layer is a dead end disguised as a choice. That's why people hate it. We made a maze when we should have made a park." A ripple of shifting glances moved through the room. Some of the younger designers, seated at the back, exchanged looks that bordered on revelation. The older executives, however, remained tense, their faces carved with skepticism. The CFO leaned forward, lacing his fingers. "Jacob, with all due respect, you're basing a $5 billion platform on a child's doodle." Jacob didn't flinch. He unfolded the drawing fully, laying it across the digital touch panel in the center of the table, and gestured to the pathways Lily had sketched. "This isn't a doodle. It's the only map in this room that actually shows people where to go without needing a manual. We've been solving for ourselves, not for them. She sees what we forgot to see." Lily, unaware of the corporate titans battling over her artwork, smiled and added, "You just have to think like people who don't know the rules. That's what Mommy says when we play treasure hunts." Her innocent remark triggered a strange kind of silence, not heavy, but thoughtful. One of the UX leads, a woman named Sarah, slowly stood up. "Jacob, what if we run a prototype based on her concept? A stripped-down path-first interface. We map out flows exactly as she's drawn, with choices branching like her lines instead of boxes and drop-downs. We can test it in a day." Mark Hudson's jaw tightened, but Jacob was already nodding. "Do it. I want a working model by tomorrow." "But Jacob," Mark began, but Jacob raised a hand to stop him, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We've tried everything else, Mark. For 5 years, we've thrown complexity at complexity. Maybe it's time we try simplicity. Even if it's 7 years old." The boardroom had turned into a strange blend of board meeting and brainstorming session, with executives and designers now leaning over the childish map as if deciphering a treasure map. The mood had shifted, cautious but alive, the first spark of possibility breaking through the suffocating fog of failure. As the room buzzed with reluctant but growing curiosity, Lily tugged at her father's sleeve and whispered, "Did I do good, Daddy?" Jacob crouched down to her level, his face softening into a rare smile. "You did better than good, Lily. You just gave them all a path out of the dark." Outside the glass walls of the conference room, New York continued to pulse with its indifferent rhythm. But within those walls, something had changed. A shift, almost imperceptible yet unstoppable, had begun. And it started with a little girl holding a crayon drawing, reminding a room full of geniuses how to see the world again. The following 24 hours blurred into a frenzy of movement that hadn't been felt inside Wexford Innovations in years. The rigid routines of boardrooms and spreadsheets gave way to a sense of urgency that pulsed through the building like electricity. Teams that had been paralyzed by endless feedback loops suddenly found themselves scribbling sketches on whiteboards, their suits exchanged for rolled-up sleeves and caffeine-fueled intensity. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible understanding among them. They were about to bet the future of a billion-dollar company on a child's drawing. Sarah Thompson, the UX lead who had been the first to recognize the spark in Lily's diagram, commandeered the design labs on the 46th floor. She and her team transformed the sterile, glass-walled space into what felt like an artist's workshop. Crumpled sketches littered the floors, tablets blinked with rough wireframes, and the air was filled with rapid exchanges of ideas, some bold, some ridiculous, but all of them alive. For the first time, the word user wasn't being thrown around as a target metric or a persona profile. They were now imagining real people. People who didn't care about complex AI-driven dashboards or how many customizable widgets you could fit on a home screen. They cared about simplicity, clarity, and ease, things that a 7-year-old had understood better than a room of experts. Jacob Wells spent those hours moving from floor to floor, not as the looming CEO who barked orders from a corner office, but as a man who was rediscovering the company he had once dreamed of building. He listened. He watched as young developers argued over how to translate Lily's paths into navigable flows. He caught glimpses of scribbled notes like, "Make it feel like a park" or "Lily's Law, no dead ends." He didn't need to push them. The energy was there now. They were no longer working out of fear of failure, they were working towards something that felt human again. Late into the night, Sarah's team presented the first interactive prototype to Jacob. The interface was unpolished, raw around the edges, but it was undeniably different. Gone were the cascading menus, the labyrinth of options that required a manual to navigate. Instead, the home screen greeted the user with a visual map, a fluid, branching layout that adapted as one explored, each choice presented as a natural continuation of the previous one. It was intuitive in a way no corporate design guideline could have produced. It felt playful, exploratory, yet elegantly simple. Jacob tested it himself. He wasn't a technical person, he had built Wexford with vision, not code, but even he could feel the difference. There was no sense of friction, no cognitive overload. Each tap felt like walking down a familiar path, exactly as Lily had described. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. The next morning, they ran the prototype through a user focus group composed of ordinary city residents, teachers, baristas, delivery drivers, elderly retirees, and college students. For weeks, previous iterations of Aurora had been met with blank stares, frustration, and comments that stabbed into the team's pride like daggers. But this time was different. People smiled as they used it. They leaned forward, curious, asking questions not out of confusion but because they wanted to explore more. An elderly man named Charles, who had openly admitted to being afraid of technology, navigated the prototype effortlessly and remarked, "Feels like walking through my neighborhood." The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but what struck Jacob most wasn't just the words, it was the expressions. Users weren't intimidated. They weren't overwhelmed. They felt guided, not controlled. News of the prototype's success spread like wildfire through the company. What had started as a desperate gamble now became a rallying point. Teams that had grown cynical after years of corporate red tape began to believe again. The mechanical gears of Wexford's bureaucratic machinery, long rusted with process and protocol, began to turn with new vigor. But not everyone was pleased. Mark Hudson, the CTO, stood watching from the sidelines, his arms folded tightly across his chest as his vision of a sleek, enterprise-grade platform was dismantled by what he considered amateur hour. He had built his entire reputation on technical supremacy, on the belief that complexity equaled innovation. To see a child's crayon drawing become the backbone of Wexford's flagship product was, to him, a professional humiliation. Mark cornered Jacob that evening in the executive lounge, away from the buzz of the design labs. The room, lined with dark mahogany and heavy leather chairs, had been Mark's sanctuary, a place where hierarchy and power still mattered. "You can't be serious about pushing this into production, Jacob," Mark said, his tone sharp, his jaw clenched. "We've spent half a decade building a scalable, modular platform. You're tossing it all for a coloring book." Jacob didn't respond immediately. He walked to the window, looking down at the city that sprawled endlessly beneath them. The lights of New York flickered like stars trapped in a glass jar. For so long, he had viewed the city from this height, detached and strategic. Now, it felt different. He thought about Lily's drawing, about the focus group's laughter, about the spark he'd seen in his team for the first time in years. "I'm not tossing it, Mark," Jacob said, his voice calm but unyielding. "I'm fixing it. You're right, we built something scalable, modular, technically flawless. But we forgot who it was for. We built a city with no doors, no streets, just locked rooms. Lily drew the streets back in." Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, his ego battling to keep control. But Jacob didn't flinch. He had made his decision. Over the next week, Wexford's prototype evolved rapidly. Every department aligned with laser focus, feeding into a development cycle that was no longer bogged down by committee politics. Investors, initially skeptical, were given private demos and left those sessions visibly shaken, not by the technical novelty, but by the pure, undeniable usability of it. For once, they saw a product that people actually wanted to use. By the end of that week, Wexford Innovations was no longer the company scrambling to salvage a failed project. It was a company that had rediscovered its heartbeat. And none of it would have happened if a little girl hadn't walked into a room full of adults and reminded them how to build for humans, not metrics. The boardroom was packed once again, but this time the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of anticipation and silent hostility. Word had spread about the prototype's success in internal tests and among select focus groups. There were even whispers in the hallways that this stripped-down Park Path interface, born from a child's drawing, might not only save the Aurora project but redefine the entire smart city platform. Yet, for every person who dared to believe in this unexpected turn of fortune, there were others whose egos were threatened, whose careers had been built on layers of complexity and systems they now feared might become obsolete. Mark Hudson, the chief technology officer, sat rigidly at the far end of the table. His face, usually composed, now carried a thin mask of professionalism barely concealing his simmering resentment. To Mark, the sudden infatuation with this Lily interface, as some had mockingly started calling it, felt like an outright betrayal of everything the company had stood for. He had invested not just years of his life, but his personal identity into Aurora's original architecture. Watching it be reimagined through crayon lines and playground metaphors was a humiliation he couldn't swallow. Jacob Wells, however, was unmoved by the undercurrents of dissent flowing through the room. He stood at the head of the table, a large touchscreen display in front of him showcasing the new prototype in real time. His light blue suit, the same one from the fateful meeting when Lily had first entered the room, seemed symbolic now, an emblem of a leader who had chosen to see clarity in simplicity, even if it meant standing against his own board. "Before we proceed," Jacob began, his voice even, controlled, "I want to address what's been circulating over the past few days. Yes, the new interface was inspired by Lily's drawing. Yes, it's drastically different from what we originally envisioned. But it works. Our early tests are not just promising, they are transformative. This isn't about sentimentality. This is about survival." The CFO, Richard Barnes, an older man whose loyalty had always aligned with the stock price, leaned forward, steepling his fingers. His voice was calm but lined with skepticism. "Jacob, no one denies the initial feedback is positive, but we're not a startup anymore. Wexford has obligations, to shareholders, to city governments, to infrastructure contracts. A complete pivot this late in the game is reckless. We'd be abandoning years of work. You're asking us to sign off on a prototype that hasn't been battle-tested in a live environment. Sarah Thompson, seated next to Jacob, intervened, her tone sharp with frustration but backed by data. With all due respect, Richard, the previous version was tested extensively and still failed to connect with real users. We were optimizing a system that no one wanted. The prototype may be new, but its core solves the root problem, accessibility. It's not reckless to fix what's broken. Mark Hudson seized the moment to strike. He rose from his chair, straightening his blazer as if donning armor. Jacob, Sarah, I admire your enthusiasm, but let's not forget, this entire system's backend is built on a modular framework that supports scalable microservices. What you're proposing is a user experience overhaul that will require a full rework of our foundational code. We can't just paint over the architecture with pastel colors and hope for the best. There are technical realities here. The platform's complexity is a necessity, not a flaw. The room fell into a tense silence. Eyes shifted between Mark and Jacob, the standoff palpable. But Jacob didn't respond with technical jargon. He didn't argue scalability or back-end frameworks. Instead, he reached for a remote and projected a short video clip onto the wall. It was a raw, unscripted recording from the recent focus group. An elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, was navigating the prototype on a tablet. Her fingers trembled slightly, yet she moved through the interface with a smile. At one point, she laughed and said, "This feels like walking through my garden. I know exactly where to go, and I don't need my grandson to show me how." The video ended. Jacob turned back to the board, his expression calm but loaded with an authority that left no room for further posturing. That's the technical reality I care about, Mark. If a 75-year-old woman can navigate a smart city platform without frustration, then I don't care how many lines of back-end code we have to rewrite. Complexity that alienates the user is bad design, no matter how sophisticated it looks in a technical diagram. The weight of his words settled over the room. Even Richard Barnes, who had moments ago questioned the pivot, looked visibly affected. The problem was no longer theoretical. It had a face, a voice, a human anchor that couldn't be dismissed with a PowerPoint slide. But Mark wasn't done. Cornered, his tone shifted from professional to venomous, exposing the raw nerve. And what happens when the media finds out we rebuilt our flagship product based on a child's sketch? You think investors will be charmed? You're gambling the company's credibility on a 7-year-old's whimsy, Jacob. The attack was personal, calculated to provoke, but Jacob's response was swift, sharper than any retort Mark could have anticipated. I'd rather stake this company's future on a 7-year-old's clarity than on a roomful of adults who lost sight of the people they're supposed to serve. The tension snapped like a cable under too much strain. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, it was a pause filled with the gravity of an irreversible turning point. Richard Barnes finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling a slow breath. "Let's run the pilot," he said, his tone no longer skeptical but resigned to the inevitable shift. "If it fails, we'll know soon enough. But if it works, we'll have a case study the entire industry will never forget." Sarah gave a small nod of vindication. The younger members of the board, the ones who had watched the focus group with gleaming eyes, began to murmur agreements. Mark Hudson, however, sat down slowly, his expression a mask of defeat laced with smoldering resentment. He had lost this battle, but the war within his pride was far from over. As the meeting adjourned, Jacob caught a glimpse of Lily's crayon drawing, now carefully framed on the wall near the entrance. It stood there like a quiet guardian, a reminder that in a world obsessed with innovation, sometimes the purest solutions are the ones that don't come from years of experience, but from a heart that simply sees things as they are. The following weeks at Wexford Innovations were unlike anything the company had experienced in its corporate lifetime. Gone were the structured hierarchies, the layers of bureaucratic approvals, and the suffocating chains of protocol that had once defined every project cycle. What replaced them was a kind of controlled chaos, a whirlwind of collaboration that blurred the lines between departments. Engineers sat alongside designers, marketers debated with UX specialists, and developers scribbled diagrams on glass walls while interns, previously invisible in the company's grand machine, offered insights that were actually heard. The air inside Wexford's headquarters vibrated with urgency, but it wasn't the cold panic of a company in free fall. It was the kinetic energy of a team that had suddenly remembered why they had signed up for this in the first place. The Lily interface, as it was now officially and unironically referred to in internal documents, had transitioned from a rogue prototype into the centerpiece of Wexford's strategy. Every element of the Smart City platform was now being re-evaluated through the lens of Lily's original drawing. Each feature, whether it was traffic optimization, waste management, or emergency services, had to pass a singular test: could an ordinary person, with no instruction manual, navigate it intuitively? This criterion became the gospel that guided every design sprint and development huddle. Sarah Thompson found herself leading a task force that operated more like a creative studio than a corporate product team. She had transformed the 46th floor into a living lab, where ideas were born, killed, and resurrected in real time. One wall was covered in pinned-up photos of ordinary citizens, school teachers, single parents, small business owners, elderly residents. Each person had their own storyboard that mapped out how they would engage with the city's services using the new interface. The team wasn't just building for users anymore, they were building for Charles, who needed real-time bus schedules, and Maria, who struggled with confusing utility bills, and Greg, a single father trying to navigate school enrollment systems. Jacob Wells moved through this reimagined workspace not as a distant executive but as a constant, active participant. He reviewed sketches with junior designers, sat in on late-night coding marathons, and even took part in impromptu coffee-fueled debates about button placement and color schemes. His presence wasn't overbearing. It was grounding. The man who once ruled from the penthouse was now shoulder to shoulder with his team, driven by a shared clarity of purpose. But not everything was smooth. There were still those within Wexford who viewed the transformation with skepticism or outright resistance. Mark Hudson had retreated into his own faction, a dwindling but vocal group of engineers who believed the company was abandoning its technical prestige. While he outwardly complied with the board's decision to pilot the new interface, internally, he maneuvered to retain control over core system architecture, warning his loyalists that this circus will collapse when it faces real-world demands. Yet even Mark couldn't deny the data. Early pilot tests conducted in 2 partner cities, one a mid-sized urban area in Oregon, the other a bustling district in Singapore, yielded results that were difficult to refute. Resident engagement with city services soared by 68% in just the first week. Customer support calls dropped dramatically. The systems that had once required hours of onboarding were now being navigated with ease by people of all ages. News outlets began to pick up on the story, intrigued by the narrative of a failing tech giant that had rediscovered its soul through the eyes of a child. The media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it revitalized investor interest. Stock analysts who had written off Wexford as a sinking ship were now cautiously revising their forecasts. On the other hand, the story's human angle, centered around a 7-year-old girl's innocent drawing, became the focal point of every article, every segment. Phrases like, "the child who saved the city" and "Lily's law of design" began circulating across social media. For Jacob, this was both a blessing and a burden. The world loved a good redemption arc, but he knew that public curiosity was fickle. If the company failed to deliver when the system went live at scale, Wexford would not only face financial ruin but a far more humiliating public fall from grace. Sarah and her team doubled down. They organized live user sessions in public spaces, setting up booths where ordinary citizens could interact with the prototype and provide immediate feedback. The initiative wasn't a PR stunt, it was a data goldmine. Every interaction was logged, analyzed, and fed back into the development loop in near real time. The design evolved daily, sometimes hourly, shaped not by executive assumptions but by real human behavior. Amidst the whirlwind of activity, Lily herself remained blissfully unaware of the corporate storm her drawing had ignited. To her, visits to the office were still adventures, opportunities to show her father her latest crayon creations and to occasionally offer childlike critiques of color choices in UI mock-ups. She didn't understand the stakes, and perhaps that was what made her perspective so valuable. She approached problems without the baggage of failure, without the obsession with what couldn't be done. She simply saw what should be done. One afternoon, during a particularly intense review session, Lily wandered into the lab where Sarah's team was struggling with a particularly thorny issue regarding emergency service alerts. The team had been debating for hours about how to streamline urgent notifications without overwhelming users. Lily, observing from a corner with a juice box in hand, asked innocently, "Why don't you just make it a red balloon? Everyone looks at balloons." The room went silent. Within minutes, the idea had sparked a new design iteration where critical alerts would appear as floating, animated icons that gently but unmistakably drew attention. The pilot program's success reached a crescendo when the Singapore district reported an unprecedented 82% satisfaction rate from residents interacting with the smart city platform. Local officials, initially cautious, became vocal advocates, appearing in interviews praising Wexford's human-first design philosophy. The Lily interface had transitioned from an internal code name to a public symbol of technological empathy. Yet, beneath the surface of this success, Jacob remained acutely aware of the looming threat. Mark Hudson had not vanished. His silence in recent days was not surrender, it was a strategic retreat. Jacob knew Mark well enough to understand that a man who had built his career on complexity would not simply fade into the background. He was planning something. But for now, the victory was undeniable. Wexford Innovations, a company that had once prided itself on engineering marvels at the expense of human experience, had rediscovered its purpose. The very empire that had been on the brink of collapse was now being rebuilt, not with code or capital, but with a simple drawing that reminded everyone of the most overlooked principle in technology: people don't want to feel smart when using a system, they just want to feel understood. While the rest of Wexford Innovations basked in the glow of their unexpected resurgence, Mark Hudson's office became an island of quiet defiance. The man who had once been heralded as the architect of Wexford's technological dominance now sat isolated, his towering ego battered by what he considered to be a wave of childish naivety sweeping through the company. To the world, Wexford was on the verge of a design revolution, but to Mark, it was a betrayal, an abandonment of the engineering excellence that had built their empire in the first place. And in his mind, no revolution could survive without a reckoning. Mark had never been a man to confront problems directly when he could maneuver behind closed doors. Over the years, he had built a quiet network of influence within Wexford, senior engineers who owed him their careers, vendors with long-standing contracts, and, most importantly, connections with third-party contractors who handled sensitive back-end development far from the public eye. It was through these channels that Mark began orchestrating his counterstrike. If he couldn't win the battle in the boardroom, he would wage his war in the shadows. His plan was elegantly ruthless. Wexford's new interface, for all its charm and public appeal, was still deeply entwined with a back-end infrastructure that Mark and his loyalists controlled. The company's core systems, especially those handling data integration across city networks, were notoriously complex. By selectively leaking parts of the platform's unrefined code to a competing firm under the guise of industry collaboration, Mark intended to sow doubt about Wexford's readiness for large-scale deployment. His goal wasn't to destroy the company outright but to engineer a crisis of confidence severe enough to force the board to retreat back to the old ways, the ways he could control. The leak was subtle. Just a few snippets of early-stage code, paired with offhand remarks in closed technical forums about security concerns and scalability risks. Within days, rumors began circulating in tech circles that Wexford's Lily interface might be little more than a beautiful facade masking a dangerously fragile infrastructure. Competitor firms, smelling blood, began whisper campaigns among investors, suggesting that the company's recent success was built on a house of cards. Tech journalists, always hungry for a twist, started digging for weaknesses, framing their narratives around the question, could a child's drawing really be the foundation of a smart city? Jacob Wells was not blindsided. He had known Mark too long to underestimate his capacity for sabotage. But even he was taken aback by how quickly the rumors escalated. Overnight, the tone of media coverage shifted from admiration to scrutiny. Analysts began questioning whether Wexford's sudden pivot to radical simplicity was sustainable. Headlines speculated about potential data breaches and questioned whether Wexford had sacrificed technical rigor for feel-good stories. The board, which had recently begun to show cautious support, grew anxious. Richard Barnes, always the barometer of shareholder sentiment, called for an emergency meeting. The confidence that had been so painstakingly rebuilt was now teetering, and Jacob found himself facing a familiar but no less infuriating scenario, defending a vision against a wave of manufactured doubt. In that emergency boardroom session, the atmosphere was suffocating. Executives who had just weeks ago championed the new direction were now hedging their bets, speaking in guarded phrases about balancing innovation with stability. Mark sat silently through most of the meeting, his expression a mask of detached professionalism, but Jacob knew he was watching, savoring every moment of the board's growing unease. When Jacob finally spoke, his words cut through the fog of corporate hand-wringing. He didn't waste time refuting the rumors point by point. Instead, he presented a bold, almost reckless counteroffensive. If they question our transparency, we'll give them more transparency than they know what to do with. We're opening a live beta to the public. Full access. Real users, real data, in real time. The room recoiled at the suggestion. A live public beta, at this stage, was unheard of. It was a high-risk maneuver that could either cement Wexford's credibility or expose every vulnerability critics had been salivating over. Richard Barnes, his face tight with concern, voiced what everyone else was thinking. Jacob, if this blows up, it'll be a PR disaster. You're giving them ammunition. But Jacob stood firm. He knew that retreating now would be the real disaster. The only thing worse than having your weaknesses exposed is hiding them and hoping no one looks. We've spent too long pretending complexity equals security. Let's show them that clarity can be bulletproof. The decision was made. Within 48 hours, Wexford announced an unprecedented open beta for their Smart City platform. The announcement sent shockwaves through the industry. Some praised the boldness, others labeled it desperation. But as thousands of users logged in to test the system, something remarkable happened. The platform held. It didn't buckle under the load, didn't crumble under scrutiny. Bugs were found, of course, but they were addressed in real time, with updates rolling out so swiftly that users began praising Wexford's responsiveness. The public, far more forgiving than analysts had anticipated, appreciated the transparency. For them, the imperfections weren't failures, they were proof that Wexford was listening. But it wasn't just the public who took notice. The media narrative, so quick to sharpen its knives, began to shift once again. Stories emerged about the tech giant embracing vulnerability and designing in public. The open beta, rather than exposing Wexford's flaws, had humanized the company, transforming it from a faceless corporation into a dynamic, evolving partner in the smart city vision. Mark Hudson's plan had backfired spectacularly. The very leak he had orchestrated to undermine confidence had forced Wexford into a position of radical openness, and instead of collapsing under the pressure, the company had thrived. His influence, once absolute within the technical circles of Wexford, now waned. The engineers he had counted on began to drift towards the new paradigm, drawn not by corporate loyalty but by the undeniable momentum of a vision that was, against all odds, working. For Jacob, the crisis had not been without scars. The battles within his own leadership had tested every ounce of his resilience. But as he watched his team navigate the challenges with grit and creativity, he realized that the company was no longer his alone. Wexford had become a collective, a fusion of hardened professionals and fresh perspectives, bound by a singular, human-focused mission. And at the center of it all was a crayon drawing, now more than ever a symbol of the idea that simplicity wasn't weakness, it was the highest form of mastery. The open beta had lit a fuse that no one at Wexford Innovations could have predicted. What had started as a desperate gamble to salvage credibility had evolved into a grassroots movement that swept through the tech community with a force that even Jacob Wells hadn't dared to imagine. Developers, designers, urban planners, and ordinary citizens from across the globe began to flood Wexford's public forums with feedback, suggestions, bug reports, and, most importantly, ideas. It was no longer just a product rollout. It had become a collaborative experiment on a scale the company had never attempted, a living organism that grew, adapted, and reshaped itself in real time. Jacob had envisioned the beta as a temporary lifeline, a way to buy time and trust while stabilizing the system. What he hadn't anticipated was that people wouldn't just test the product, they would adopt it. Neighborhood groups in small towns started using the interface to organize community cleanups. School districts found ways to simplify parent-teacher communication through its intuitive design. Local businesses began integrating with the city services in ways the original Aurora architecture had never intended. Wexford's platform was no longer a rigid corporate solution, it had become a canvas for people to build their own solutions, each adapted to their unique local needs. The design labs, once chaotic in their urgency, found a new rhythm, a kind of controlled storm where every suggestion from the community was triaged, evaluated, and, if viable, implemented with dizzying speed. The feedback loop between Wexford and its users had become so direct that updates were sometimes rolled out within hours of receiving a public suggestion. Sarah Thompson, who now led the Community Integration Task Force, compared it to surfing a tidal wave where the board is still being built under your feet. But despite the pace, the team was energized in a way that made the previous months of corporate gridlock feel like a bad dream. In an inspired move, Jacob announced a global hackathon, inviting teams from around the world to contribute modules, widgets, and even entirely new features to the platform. But this wasn't the kind of hackathon where the winners received a meaningless trophy and a handshake. Wexford promised that the best ideas would be integrated into the live system within weeks, with full credit given to the contributors. It was an audacious act of transparency, one that resonated with a tech community long jaded by closed-door corporate arrogance. Within days, submissions poured in, some from professional developers, others from high school coding clubs, and even from retired engineers who had long since left the corporate grind but saw in Wexford's new approach a reason to dust off their skills. One such submission came from a small group of university students in Finland who developed an accessibility feature that translated service alerts into tactile feedback for visually impaired users. The Wexford team, impressed by its elegance, integrated it into the system in under 72 hours, and the story went viral. The narrative had shifted yet again. Wexford wasn't just innovating, it was democratizing innovation. For Jacob, the hackathon became a proving ground, not just for the product, but for the philosophy that had emerged from Lily's drawing. He saw, with growing clarity, that by relinquishing control over every detail, they had unlocked a form of creative abundance that no centralized design team could ever manufacture. It was humbling. The CEO of a global tech giant, standing in the middle of a sprawling digital town square where anyone with a good idea had a voice. Lily, unaware of the tectonic shifts her simple sketch had triggered, remained a constant, gentle presence in her father's life during these intense days. She often wandered into the development hubs with a new drawing in hand, offering critiques like, "This button is too grumpy," or "People won't follow sad arrows, Daddy." To the team, these moments had become talismans of sorts, grounding reminders of why they were working the way they were. Sarah even created a wall titled Lilyisms, where the team pinned up her innocent observations that, more often than not, carried more design wisdom than an entire semester at a design school. But as Wexford soared in public perception, the internal wounds from months of conflict had not yet fully healed. Mark Hudson, watching from the sidelines, had become a specter, a name no one mentioned aloud but whose shadow was still felt in every meeting. His failed attempt to sabotage the platform had left him marginalized within the company, but Jacob knew better than to assume Mark's silence equaled surrender. A man like Hudson didn't fade away, he waited for the right moment to reassert his influence. Despite this undercurrent of unease, the hackathon's finale became a landmark event. Wexford hosted a live-streamed global showcase where the top contributors presented their innovations directly to a worldwide audience. It wasn't just a product demo, it was a celebration of collective creativity. Cities that had once viewed Wexford's platform with skepticism were now lining up to participate in pilot programs. Government officials, tech leaders, and media personalities all tuned in to witness what had become a new blueprint for civic technology, an approach that embraced imperfection, welcomed public critique, and thrived on collaboration. Jacob stood on the main stage, flanked by Sarah and several of the community developers whose contributions had shaped the platform's evolution. Behind them, a massive screen displayed a live heat map of global user activity, dots of engagement lighting up across continents. For a brief moment, Jacob felt the weight of the past months lift, replaced by a quiet sense of vindication. They had not only saved the company, they had rewritten its DNA. As the applause echoed through the auditorium, the camera feed cut to a pre-recorded video of Lily, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Jacob's home office, holding up the original crayon drawing. She smiled into the lens and said, "Thanks for listening to my paths." The moment went viral within minutes. It wasn't planned as a marketing stunt, but it became one of the most shared clips in tech history. Analysts, commentators, and everyday users alike found in that simple statement a distillation of everything Wexford's journey had represented: the power of listening, the courage to simplify, and the humility to let go of control. But amidst the celebration, Jacob's mind remained alert. He knew the path ahead was still fraught with challenges. Success breeds competition, and the very openness that had saved them could be exploited by rivals who had none of Wexford's human-first ethos. Moreover, Mark Hudson's silence was beginning to feel less like defeat and more like a gathering storm waiting for its moment to strike back. For now, though, they had won the day. The empire that had once stood on the brink of collapse had not only been saved but transformed into something far greater, a living, breathing collaboration between technology and humanity. The lines between creator and user had blurred, and in that fusion, Wexford had found a new identity. And it had all begun with a little girl who believed that people should walk on paths, not into walls. The transformation of Wexford Innovations was now a headline that spanned continents. In less than a year, the company had gone from being a symbol of corporate rigidity and impending failure to a pioneer of open-source civic technology. Cities from Tokyo to Buenos Aires lined up to adopt the platform. Investors who had once distanced themselves from the crumbling tech giant now clamored to be part of its meteoric resurgence, and industry leaders who had once scoffed at the idea of simplicity began revising their own strategies to follow Wexford's model. Yet amidst the accolades and global attention, Jacob Wells knew that the most difficult chapter was yet to be written. The platform's success had created new pressures, ones far more complex than the technical challenges they had faced in the past. Scaling a user-driven ecosystem was no longer just about infrastructure or design, it was about trust. The openness that had become Wexford's greatest strength was also its most vulnerable flank. Every city that adopted the system, every community that contributed to its evolution, increased the platform's reach but also made it a target for exploitation. The future of Wexford hinged on maintaining a delicate balance between accessibility and integrity, and Jacob understood that even a single misstep could unravel everything they had built. It was in this crucible of triumph and tension that Mark Hudson re-emerged, not as a saboteur working in the shadows, but as a visible, vocal critic. He had left Wexford in the aftermath of his failed attempts to undermine the project, retreating into a calculated silence that many had mistaken for defeat. But Mark was not the kind of man to accept irrelevance. He resurfaced as the figurehead of a newly formed consortium of traditional infrastructure firms and cybersecurity experts who began publicly challenging Wexford's open model. Cloaking his motives in the rhetoric of public safety and data integrity, Mark positioned himself as a defender of technological rigor in an age of reckless democratization, as he called it. Media outlets, always eager for conflict narratives, seized upon the emerging rivalry. Headlines spoke of an impending clash between the empire of walls and the empire of paths. Debates flooded social platforms, where advocates of Wexford's user-centric philosophy clashed with those who echoed Mark's warnings about systemic vulnerabilities and the perils of sacrificing control for the sake of inclusivity. What began as a design philosophy was now being framed as a battle for the soul of future cities. Jacob, though unshaken in his belief, knew that a prolonged public war of words would not suffice. The only way to truly silence the doubts was to scale the platform to a level that no critic could undermine. And that opportunity came unexpectedly, in the form of a crisis. A Category 5 hurricane had torn through the southeastern coast, devastating several mid-sized cities whose digital infrastructures were left in disarray. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and critical city functions like utilities, traffic control, and public safety communications had collapsed under outdated, centralized systems. Amid the chaos, one of the affected cities, already a Wexford pilot participant, reached out, asking if the platform could be adapted to support real-time crisis coordination. It was the ultimate stress test. Within hours, Wexford's teams mobilized. Developers, designers, and community contributors formed a rapid response task force. They stripped down the platform to its bare essentials, reconfiguring it to prioritize emergency alerts, resource distribution, and community-led assistance coordination. What would have taken months in a traditional development cycle was achieved in less than 3 days. Citizens, through the same intuitive interface that had guided them in everyday tasks, were now using the platform to find shelters, report infrastructure damage, coordinate volunteer efforts, and even reconnect families separated during the evacuation. The response was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time, a city's residents were not passive victims awaiting top-down instructions. They were active participants in their own recovery, empowered by a system that was designed not to control them but to guide and amplify their collective efforts. The media narrative shifted overnight. Stories emerged not of bureaucratic failures but of neighborhoods organizing supply chains through their smartphones, of elderly residents being located and rescued through community-coordinated efforts within minutes, not hours. Mark Hudson's warnings about the dangers of reckless openness now rang hollow. His image, once synonymous with technological prowess, was rapidly becoming that of an outdated gatekeeper clinging to a collapsing doctrine. The public had seen what decentralized, human-first technology could achieve when lives were on the line, and no amount of fear-mongering could erase that image. In the weeks that followed, Wexford's platform was formally adopted as a foundational component of emergency management systems in multiple regions. What had begun as a smart city convenience tool had now evolved into an essential civic infrastructure, trusted not just for its technological elegance but for its ability to empower ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. At the company's annual summit, now a global event streamed to millions, Jacob Wells took the stage not as the embattled CEO fighting for survival but as the architect of a movement. He spoke not of profits or market share but of purpose, of how technology, when designed with humility and openness, could transcend its tools and become an extension of human will and empathy. But the summit's most impactful moment came not from Jacob, but from Lily. She had been invited to join him on stage, a request she had accepted with the casual innocence of a child who did not fully grasp the magnitude of her influence. Dressed in a simple yellow dress, holding the now iconic frame drawing, Lily walked up to the podium and, in a voice amplified to a global audience, said, "You don't need to know all the answers if you make paths that everyone can walk together." The audience, both in the auditorium and across the digital world, erupted. It wasn't the applause of shareholders celebrating a successful quarter, nor the cheer of consumers dazzled by sleek technology. It was a moment of collective recognition, that a new paradigm had been born, not in a boardroom, but in the simple wisdom of a child's perspective. In the aftermath of the summit, Wexford Innovations became more than a company. It became a symbol. Universities began teaching the Lilly principle as a core design philosophy. Governments cited Wexford's model as a case study in civic innovation. Even competitors, once dismissive, began adopting fragments of the open, collaborative approach, albeit reluctantly. As for Mark Hudson, his influence waned into obscurity, his arguments rendered obsolete by the very future he had tried to prevent. His legacy, once cemented in technological achievements, now stood as a cautionary tale of brilliance blinded by ego. Jacob, standing in the quiet of his office as the sun set over the cityscape, knew that Wexford's journey was far from over. The challenges ahead would be immense, and the path forward would not always be clear. But as he glanced at Lilly's drawing, still pinned to his wall, vibrant as ever, he smiled. The empire had been saved, not through dominance, but through listening, through trusting the simple truth that technology should never build walls where it can create paths. What makes the ending of this story resonate is that it isn't just about a company's comeback, it's about who gets to shape the future. Wexford's transformation wasn't driven by algorithms or boardroom strategies but by a child's unfiltered clarity. It's a reminder that innovation isn't always about being smarter or faster, sometimes, it's about being willing to see through all the noise. The beauty of this ending is that it leaves you with a paradox: a billion-dollar empire, built on years of technical complexity, was saved not by more technology, but by stripping it back to human simplicity. It challenges the idea that only experts and specialists can define progress. Instead, it suggests that real innovation happens when you let go of ego and listen, even if the voice is small, innocent, and holding a crayon. But it's also a cautionary tale. As much as Wexford won, the threat of people like Mark Hudson will always exist, those who fear losing control more than they fear failing their mission. The story's happy ending isn't naive, it's hard-earned, and fragile. It takes courage to keep systems open, to let others in, and to admit you don't have all the answers. That's why, to me, this ending feels less like a victory lap and more like a starting line for a new kind of leadership, one where humility, empathy, and simplicity are seen not as weaknesses, but as the ultimate form of strength.